Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome or welcome back. So today I'm taking inspiration from a fellow booktuber named Brandon at Shelf Seeker, and I'll link his channel below. He recently did a video where he talked about top 10 favorite books of all time, or 10 books that really impacted him. So I thought what would be kind of a cool idea was to adapt that and make it 10 books that kind of made me who I am today as a reader. So I went chronologically from books from way back when I was a kid, all, up until now. And I thought it was interesting to kind of see how my reading evolved. So I have my list over here. The first series that really, really had an impact on me was the Junie B Jones series by Barbara Park. They are a series of books for kids, probably around the age of 10-ish, maybe a little bit younger even. So Junie B is this girl who is entering the first grade, and so you kind of follow her story of when she is, getting ready for school, in school, her summers, her weekends, whatever. I think it's a really cool book series to give to your kid when they're just starting to read bigger books, like non-picture books, So the next book is actually not just one book. And this was in French so the author and illustrator is Michel Ocelot. So those are Prince et Princesse, or Prince and Princess in English. These two were the first I got to. However, I read a lot of Michel Ocelot's works. As I sort of alluded to, he is also an illustrator, and so these are actually comic books, or I guess you could call them very short graphic novels. To be honest, I'm still not clear on the difference, okay? Essentially the story of two actors who are kind of writing different plays, and in each play they go into a different time in history and they really act it out, like they, get the costumes and everything, and then you get an immersion. And they just have this storyline that takes place in that time period. And it's very cool because it's a very easy watch/read, and the graphics are gorgeous. I mean, seriously. And so the next one I got to as a kid was Kirikou. So Kirikou is this story, and I think this play takes place in Tanzania, if I'm not mistaken. He's a kid who grows up in a village. He's like super an overachiever, I think. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but he births himself and he fights this local witch in one of the stories, and then there are a few other stories of Kirikou where he kind of defends his village even though he's a little child. But the stories are just so beautiful. And then the third stories from Michel Ocelot that I got to. Now this one, the two previous ones I got to in the book form, this is a movie, but also worth mentioning, is Azur and Asmar. So Azur and Asmar is a story, I forget what time period it takes place, but Azur is the child of this rich family in France. I want to say 16th, 17th century, something like that. Don't quote me on that. And so they have a maid, and Azur befriends the maid's son because they're the same age. Eventually the maid gets fired and she's forced to go back to her local country with her son. And so you follow Azur's story. I almost went in French there. And once he's an adult, he decides he wants to go find his friend. And also, so I forget exactly what country they're from, but they're from somewhere in the Middle East where they believe in jinns. And when he was a kid, the maid would tell him a lot of stories of the jinn fairies and stuff. So as an adult, he really held on to that, and he said, I'm going to find the jinn fairy, and some legend about freeing her or something. I can't remember exactly. I want to watch it again. I'm going to watch it again after this. But it's a beautiful story. Again, I would equate Michel Ocelot's work to stories like The Little Prince, because they really are very simple stories, but incredibly deep and layered, and they are intended for children, but really they work for adults. I cannot recommend Michel Ocelot's work enough, and I am pretty sure it's been translated to English, and I'll link it if I find him. Okay, we're taking a little bit of a leap into the future here. So once I actually got into serious school and we had to read books for school and work, I quit reading for fun around that time, and I actually had a little gap where I wasn't reading for fun at all. So the first book that I really enjoyed at school, one of the first that I enjoyed reading and I actually enjoyed rereading, is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. A beautiful classic. I really was into historical fiction at that time, and I still am, not as much as I used to, but I think To Kill a Mockingbird really appealed to me because it was still simple language. It's a beautiful story. And I had a really cool English teacher, but I think it was also the first time where I took the time to read the book and watch the movie and compare the two. And I had a really cool English teacher, which helps a lot. The next one I want to talk about is actually two books together. These were actually required reading in French. So if you were ever wondering what kind of books we read in French class in France, these would be kind of the likes of them. So the first one we read was L'Espèce Humaine by Robert Antelme, or The Human Species. And the second one is War. I think it's called War in English. La Douleur by Marguerite Duras. So these are two books about World War II. You will find that in France, and I'm assuming most European countries, they drill the events of World War II into your skull inside out and upside down. Yeah, in France was pretty traumatized by that, so we actually did World War II from the French perspective, from the English perspective, from the German's perspective, in history class, in French literature class, like in the 6th grade, in the 7th grade, in the 8th grade. We did it so many times. It's crazy. But you know what? We found amazing books, such as L'Espèce Humaine. So I'm going to tell you about this one first. And if you're going to read both, I would recommend reading The Human Species first. So Robert Antelme, who was actually sent to, I believe it was Birkenau. I may be mistaken. It's been a while since I read it. But he was sent to a concentration camp. And so L'Espèce Humaine is his story, his personal account of his time in a concentration camp. And he tells a little bit of how he got out and a little bit of his life after he got out. But here's where things get really interesting. Marguerite Duras is an activist, a feminist activist. War is about her time as a resistant during World War II. She talks about all the things she did as a resistant. And side note, she and Robert Antelme were lovers. Yeah, even though she was married to someone else. So at the time when he got out of the concentration camp, she actually took him in to nurse him back to health. And what's super interesting is that she tells the story of what it was like nursing him back to health. And so you get Robert Antelme's story continued in her book, parts that he doesn't talk about in his book. And I don't believe they coordinate. I mean, they wrote those books completely independently of each other, but it's just so fascinating to me. This is the first time when I really kind of took the time to understand the dynamics between books, and that was for French class. Next up, I want to mention Charles Baudelaire. That noise was the cat. Charles Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal, or Flowers of Evil. And I also want to mention Arthur Rimbaud, who is another French author who really speaks to my soul. I just love their dark decadence. I could talk so much about it, but actually I made a whole video about it, which I'll link below. I actually made it in collab with Pax Panic, who is no longer with us, so rest in peace, Pax. Definitely check out that video where I talk about Poètes Maudits, or haunted poets, and it's very cool. Also required reading in French class. So the next book, here's where things get interesting, okay? The next book was actually required reading in English class. I was in an international school, so it's not just like the regular English classes in France. This is like special type of English class. But it's the first book that actually triggered something inside of me that made me want to read for fun. And that book is The Memory of Love by Aminatta Forna. She is or was a BBC journalist who also wrote many fiction books. And so Memory of Love takes place in Sierra Leone, which is her home country. Well, she was actually born in Ireland, but she spent most of her life in Sierra Leone. And it's a historical fiction that takes place during and a little bit after the Civil War in Sierra Leone, which was very gruesome. You follow the main character, Adrian, who is an Englishman who goes to Sierra Leone after the Civil War as relief. I think he's a psychologist. You follow him interacting with some of his patients and them telling him their story from the Civil War. And also you follow his adventures kind of associating or, interacting with Sierra Leone's culture. And for one, discovering a new culture, for, also being, the white guy in a, former colony, or was it a former colony or still a colony at the time? I forget, but it's such a beautiful book. If you like historical fiction and you don't mind dark history, this is the book for you. It is absolutely beautiful. And so there I was on my merry way to find books that I wanted to read on my own time. And so I was looking up books that were vintage horror. I settled on The Amityville Horror by J. Ansen. So I will admit, The Amityville Horror is not necessarily the best book I have ever read. However, I have to credit it for really launching my career as a reader, because I fell into the story immediately. J. Ansen's writing I thought was very captivating. It was very evocative. And the whole experience of reading the book and then watching the movie was very cool. And discovering the friends. So this is back in the day where you had to kind of, find movies on the internet, And just the whole process of finding the Amityville Horror and then finding out there's a sequel and then the Amityville Horror remake and then another remake. And man, that franchise has been crapped on big time. And, I'll say this since Garbagast is coming up, but the whole Amityville Horror franchise is a big pile of trash. Even the first one, and for completely different reasons. I gotta make a video about that franchise because there's too much to say about it, but it was really good. Next up, this one is really special to me because I actually read it during the pandemic. Picture New York City in April, May of 2020. The streets were empty. I cannot tell you how post-apocalyptic it was. And so what I would do is go out for a walk every day, walk around a few blocks. And also I would go to this park that was next to where I lived and read. And there was literally, when I tell you, the only time probably in the universe where you could go to New York City and there's literally no one in the streets. I mean, no one. Zilch. So during that time, I read The Green Mile by Stephen King. Now, it's a pretty harrowing story, but this book is very special, not only because of the conditions during which I read it, but because it's the first time I kind of was able to put words on what makes a book so special for me. It's so beautifully written, though, that it was able to elicit very opposing emotions from me. And that is what I love in books and movies. When a book can make you both laugh and cry, that's what I mean by opposing emotions. I have never physically cried during a book before, and I think since. But if you're into historical fiction and magical realism and you want to rip your heart to shreds, read The Green Mile. Okay, second to last, we have The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. So I had seen The Silence of the Lambs movies as a kid, and I just thought it was so cool. I loved it. I didn't know it was a book at the time. But I think the reason I loved it even more is because my mom is super scared of it. So, you know, it kind of motivates you as a teenager. The story is very close to that in the movie. However, Hannibal Lecter as a character, I wouldn't say is completely different, but they show two very different sides or facets to psychopathy. And I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to spoil it, but in the movie, Hannibal Lecter portrays the very charming, he's a little bit awkward, but the very charming side of a psychopath. In the book, he is just cruel. Kind of like Annie in Misery. And what I loved about the book too is that even though I knew the story and I had seen the movie multiple times, it still felt like while reading it, I was rediscovering the whole thing. There was I knew everything that was going to happen, but it was still extremely tense. I was gripping the book for dear life. And last but not least, I reviewed this book on my channel. It is incredible. It is Purge by Sofi Oksanen, another historical fiction. So this takes place during and a little bit after the Cold War. This really shows you wartime from the women's perspective, kind of like how all the dudes are out fighting, what the women do at home to keep the home steady. And it's very interesting because it's a story of generational trauma. Like, what would you do to survive? There's a lot of family things going on. And this book has the most devastating plot twist I have read in my life. Ça m'a troué le cul, like we say in French. That's an expression to say it tore a hole in my ass. Because it just blew it right out of me, man. And then, fun story, like I said, I did a book review about it on my channel. And so this was back when my name was Bookbound Weirdo. And so one day someone emails me and is like, yo, I work for the BBC World Book Club and we're interviewing Sofi Oksanen on Purge. Would you like to submit a question for her? And I actually did. And I ended up on their podcast, which I will also link below. Many links for you. And I was featured, and I can't remember what I asked, but it was very cool. So those were 10 books that made me the reader that I am today. I could probably make a part 2 because my life had so many books in it. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear what books are really important to you or like really stand out and have a cool story associated with them in your life. All right. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.